Say it again, but correctly this time. The words didn't come from the man at the head of the table. They came from behind him, soft but precise, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade wrapped in velvet. 3 minutes earlier, the room had belonged entirely to Ethan Caldwell. The rooftop restaurant hovered 40 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold light, the skyline stretching out like something he owned. Crystal glasses shimmered under dim chandeliers, a pianist played something slow and expensive in the corner, and every seat at the private table was filled with people who had learned how to nod before they understood. Ethan leaned back in his chair, cufflinks catching the light, a $12,000 watch resting effortlessly against his wrist. He didn't look at menus. He didn't need to. Chateau Margaux 2015, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate, each French syllable stretched just enough to be noticed. A few guests exchanged impressed glances. One man let out a quiet whistle. Another nodded as if he'd understood every nuance. No one corrected him. No one questioned him. Why would they? This was Ethan Caldwell, the man who turned startups into empires and conversations into contracts. And then there was her. Naomi Brooks moved quietly beside the table, her black uniform pressed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She carried the wine list like it weighed nothing, though her shift had already stretched past 8 hours. To most of the room she didn't exist. Just another server. Just another pair of hands. Ethan didn't look at her when he spoke again. Make sure it's properly aerated, he added, still speaking in French, still performing, still assuming. A few guests chuckled under their breath, not at a joke, but at the subtle message underneath it. She won't get it. She doesn't need to. Naomi paused for half a second. Not long enough to be noticed. Just long enough to hear the mistake. The mispronunciation. The confidence wrapped around something slightly off. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the menu, then relaxed. She nodded once, silent, and turned away. Because she had learned something long before this night, long before this room, long before people like Ethan ever spoke over her without looking. She had learned that silence could be a shield. But sometimes silence could also be a setup. Back at the service station, the city lights reflected in the glass like a second sky. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying her breath, her mind already replaying the words, the accent, the way the table had leaned into him like gravity worked differently around money. She picked up the bottle herself. Not because she had to, because she chose to. When she returned, the table barely noticed her again. Ethan was mid-sentence now, explaining market expansion, numbers rolling off his tongue like they were lighter than air. He didn't pause as she approached, didn't look up as she reached for his glass. And that's when it shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Because this time, Naomi didn't stay silent. Naomi set the bottle down with a quiet precision that did not interrupt the rhythm of the room, but somehow changed it anyway, her fingers steady as she unfolded the white linen napkin over her arm, her eyes calm, focused, present in a way no one had noticed before, and as she reached for Ethan Caldwell's glass, she spoke, her voice smooth, measured, unmistakably fluent. Monsieur, if I may, it is pronounced Margaux, not Margot, and the 2015 vintage benefits more from patience than performance. And for the first time that night, the air did not just shift, it held like the entire room had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. The pianist in the corner faltered for half a second, a single note hanging too long in the air, and Ethan's sentence stopped mid-thought, not because he chose to stop, but because something in the moment demanded it, his eyes lifting slowly, finally actually seeing her, not as a blur in motion, not as a role, but as a presence, and around the table. The subtle choreography of agreement broke apart. A woman near the end of the table lowered her glass without realizing it. Another guest leaned forward slightly, as if proximity might help him understand what had just happened, and Naomi did not rush, she did not fill the silence, she simply continued, pouring the wine with practiced ease, her wrist turning gently, the deep red liquid catching the light as it settled into the glass. It opens best after 10 minutes, she added softly, switching seamlessly between French and English, not to impress, but because it was natural, because it was hers, and the words did not perform, they landed, and Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for, but something tightened behind his eyes, something recalculated, because this was not supposed to happen, not here, not in a room he controlled, not from someone he had already dismissed without thinking. You speak French? He said finally, his tone neutral but edged with something else, something quieter, something less certain. And Naomi met his gaze for just a moment, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice even, then after the smallest pause, the kind that separates habit from truth, fluently. And the word did not boast, it settled, and around them the silence deepened, not uncomfortable but aware, because something had been revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his hand brushing against the stem of his glass, as if grounding himself in something familiar. Where did you learn? He asked, and this time he did not speak over her, did not look past her, and Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with warmth but with memory. In Paris, she said simply, and that was all, no explanation, no elaboration, just enough to redraw the entire outline of who she was in a single sentence, and the room adjusted around that new shape, because suddenly she was not just the waitress who poured the wine. She was the one who understood it, the one who could name it, correct it, place it in a world far beyond this table, and Ethan exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, his confidence still there, but no longer untouched, because for the first time that night, the performance had been interrupted, not by noise, not by force, but by something far more unsettling, something he could not buy, could not control, could not anticipate, and Naomi, already stepping back, already returning to the rhythm of the room, left behind more than a corrected word. She left behind a question that no one at that table could ignore anymore. Who had they been talking over all this time? The room did not return to normal, not completely, because once a moment like that happens, once someone unseen becomes undeniable, everything after carries a different weight, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before anyone else said a word, the subtle shift in posture. The way people looked at their glasses instead of at him, the way silence no longer worked in his favor but against him, and he did what men like him always do when control slips even slightly. He leaned forward again, reclaiming the center with a smile that was practiced, polished, almost convincing. Paris, he repeated, as if testing the word, as if it might reveal something more if he held it long enough. That is impressive. And a few guests nodded quickly, grateful for something familiar. To follow something safe, but Ethan was not finished because curiosity, when mixed with pride, does not sit quietly. So tell me, he continued, his tone light but sharpened underneath, what exactly were you doing in Paris? And this time the question did not float, it landed directly in front of her, intentional, measured, and Naomi, who had just placed another glass down at the far end of the table, paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, because she understood the difference between answering and revealing. She turned back slowly, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice carried just enough to reach everyone without forcing them to listen. Studying, she said, simple, clean, controlled, and a man near the middle of the table let out a quiet laugh, not cruel but dismissive, the kind that fills gaps when people do not know what else to say. Studying what? He asked, leaning back with a grin that assumed the answer would fit neatly into his expectations, and Naomi met his glance briefly, then returned her attention to Ethan, because she knew exactly who the question belonged to. Linguistics, she replied, and this time the word did something different. It did not just land, it lingered, because it explained too much and not enough at the same time, and Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, a small unconscious movement, but one that betrayed the calculation happening behind his composed expression. Because linguistics was not casual, it was not accidental, it required time, discipline, access, things that did not align easily with the uniform she wore. That is quite a path, he said slowly, and now there was no performance in his voice, only a careful attempt to understand the equation in front of him. And yet here you are. And it was not an insult, not exactly, but it carried the weight of one, the implication that something did not add up, that someone like her did not belong in both worlds at once, and Naomi did not react to that either. She simply adjusted the angle of the bottle in her hand, her movements precise, her expression steady. Yes, she said, and for a moment it seemed like she would leave it there, let the simplicity speak for itself, but then she added, just enough to tilt the balance again. Life does not always follow the resume people expect. And the sentence moved through the table like a quiet ripple, subtle but undeniable, because everyone there understood resumes, understood expectations, understood the invisible lines that separated who people were supposed to be from who they actually became. And Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze no longer dismissive, no longer distant but focused, present, And something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that the room felt it, because the hierarchy had changed, not loudly, not completely, but unmistakably, and Naomi, already stepping away once more, did not wait for acknowledgement, did not wait for approval. She returned to the rhythm of her work as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just rewritten the terms of the room with a few quiet sentences, but the truth lingered in the space between every glance and every breath, the kind of truth that does not need to be repeated to be understood, that the person they had overlooked was no longer invisible, and the man who had been certain of everything was now, for the first time that night, thinking twice before he spoke. The conversation should have moved on by now, that was the expectation. That was the pattern in rooms like this. Moments happened and then they were buried under laughter, contracts, and carefully timed distractions, but this one did not fade, it stayed just beneath the surface, altering the rhythm of every word that followed, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way he chose his next sentence more carefully than the last, in the way his eyes no longer skimmed past Naomi Brooks when she moved through the space, in the way control, once effortless, now required attention, and attention for a man like him was never given without purpose. Linguistics, he repeated again after a pause, this time quieter, more to himself than to the table, as if the word had not finished revealing what it meant, and one of the investors leaned in, curious now in a different way, not dismissive, not amused but engaged. How many languages do you speak? He asked, his tone light but sincere, and Naomi, who had just finished placing a plate at the far end, did not rush to answer. She turned, meeting the question with the same calm presence she had carried all night. Enough, she said softly, and a few people smiled at that, not because it was humorous, but because it refused to be reduced into a number, and Ethan watched her more closely now, studying the way she chose her words, the way she held back more than she gave, and for the first time that evening, he was not leading the conversation, he was following it, trying to understand something that did not operate within the systems he was used to controlling. That is not an answer, he said, but there was no edge in it now, only curiosity wrapped in habit, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the remark without submitting to it. It is the only one that matters, she replied, and the table fell quiet again, not with tension this time but with interest, because the exchange no longer felt like a correction, it felt like a shift, a redefinition of who held value in the room, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers still resting against the stem of his glass but no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, instead they were still deliberate, as if he was choosing not to interrupt what was unfolding. You studied in Paris, he said again, this time as a statement rather than a question, and now you are here. And Naomi nodded once, not defensive, not apologetic, just present, and for a brief moment something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need language, an understanding that this was not about where she stood now, but about everything she carried with her into that space, and Ethan glanced around the table, noticing something he had not noticed before, the way people were no longer waiting for him to speak, they were waiting to see what she would do next, and that realization did not unsettle him in the way it might have unsettled someone else, it intrigued him because power, real power, was not just about holding attention, it was about recognizing it when it shifted, and Naomi, already stepping back again, had not asked for that attention, had not claimed it. She had simply revealed something that made it impossible to ignore her any longer, and as the conversation resumed, quieter, more measured, Ethan did something he had not done all night. He watched, not as a man observing service but as a man observing someone he could not immediately define, and in that quiet observation something inside him adjusted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to change what would happen next. By now, the room had adapted to a new gravity, one that no longer orbited solely around Ethan Caldwell, and while the conversation resumed on the surface, deals and projections slipping back into place like nothing had changed, there was a quiet awareness threading through every exchange, a subtle recalibration of attention, and Ethan, who had built his life on reading rooms faster than anyone else, recognized it immediately, not as a threat, but as an anomaly, something rare enough to study, something valuable enough to pursue, and so he shifted, not loudly, not in a way that would break the flow, but deliberately. Naomi, he said, using her name for the first time, and that alone caused a few heads to turn, because names mattered in rooms like this, names signaled recognition, and recognition signaled something deeper, and Naomi paused again, turning slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. Yes, sir, she replied, and Ethan gestured lightly. toward the bottle she had just set down. "Tell me something," he continued, his tone now measured, stripped of performance. "If you were choosing, not serving, what would you pair with this table?" And the question landed differently than the ones before it. It was no longer about testing her, no longer about placing her in a position to confirm or deny expectation. It was an invitation, subtle but unmistakable, and the table felt it. The shift from assumption to inquiry. And Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood the weight of being asked, truly asked, in a room that had not considered her voice until minutes ago. She stepped closer, just enough to be heard without raising her voice, her gaze steady, not on the table, not on the guests, but directly on Ethan. "I would not choose based on the label," she said calmly, and a few people exchanged glances, intrigued now because this was no longer about wine. "I would choose based on what the room is trying to prove," she continued, her voice even, controlled, and the words settled into the space like something heavier than expected. And Ethan's eyes narrowed. Slightly, not in resistance but in focus, because he understood that she was not just answering the question, she was reframing it. "And what is the room trying to prove?" he asked, leaning in just slightly, and Naomi let a small pause sit between them, not for effect but for clarity. "That it already knows enough," she replied, and this time the silence that followed was different. It was not surprise, not discomfort, but recognition, because everyone at that table, in some quiet corner of their awareness, knew exactly what she meant, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching the edge of his expression, not defensive, not dismissive, but thoughtful, because this was not a challenge he could win with numbers or status. This was something else entirely, something that required listening instead of leading, and for a moment, he allowed that. He allowed the space to belong to someone else, and Naomi, sensing the shift had completed its arc, did not press further. She did not expand, did not explain. She simply stepped back again, returning to her role with the same quiet precision, but the role no longer defined her, not in that room, not in that moment, because what she had revealed was not just knowledge, it was perspective, and perspective once seen cannot be unseen. And as the conversation slowly found its way forward again, it carried her imprint with it, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan Caldwell, for the first time that night, was no longer the man setting the tone. He was the one learning how to hear it. The conversation did not snap back into place after that. It drifted, slower now, more careful, like everyone at the table had suddenly become aware that something unspoken was being measured, and Ethan Caldwell, who had built his reputation on controlling outcomes before they fully formed, recognized that the variables had changed, not in a way that threatened him, but in a way that demanded attention, and attention for him was always followed by intent. "Stay for a moment," he said as Naomi passed behind his chair again, his voice low but clear enough to hold her in place without forcing her. And this time the request was different from every command that had come before it. It was not about service, it was about presence, and Naomi paused, turning slightly, her expression composed, but her eyes sharper now, aware of the weight behind those words. "Yes, sir," she replied, and Ethan gestured lightly toward the empty space beside the table, not inviting her to sit, not breaking the boundaries of the room, but acknowledging them in a way that made the moment deliberate. "You said something earlier," he continued, his tone thoughtful, no longer layered with performance, "about the room trying to prove it already knows enough," and a few guests leaned in again, not out of obligation, but because the conversation had shifted into something they could not easily predict. "I would like to understand that," he added, and for a brief moment Naomi did not move, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this was no longer about a clever response. This was about choosing whether to speak truth in a space that had not been built to receive it. She stepped closer, just enough to be heard without raising her voice, her posture steady, her presence quiet but grounded. "Rooms like this," she began, her voice calm, measured, "are designed to sound certain," and the words settled into the air with a clarity that did not need emphasis. "People speak in conclusions, not questions," she continued, her gaze moving briefly across the table, not judging, not accusing, just observing. "Because uncertainty does not feel expensive," and that line lingered longer than the others, because it touched something deeper than business, deeper than wine. It touched identity. And Ethan's expression shifted again, not outwardly, but in the stillness behind his eyes, because he understood exactly what she meant, and more importantly, he recognized the truth in it, a truth that did not flatter him, but did not threaten him either. It challenged him, and challenge, when it was real, was something he respected. "And you," he said after a pause, his voice quieter now, more direct. You are not trying to prove anything. And it was not a question, it was an observation, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without deflection. No, sir, she replied, simple, steady. I am trying to see clearly. And the room went still again, not because of the words themselves, but because of how they landed, because clarity, real clarity, was something none of them could buy. And for a moment no one spoke, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. And Ethan leaned back slowly, his hand resting against the table, his posture no longer signaling control, but consideration, because something in that exchange had shifted beyond hierarchy, beyond roles, into something far more rare, understanding. And Naomi, sensing the moment had reached its natural end, stepped back once more, returning to the quiet rhythm of her work. But the space she left behind did not close, it remained, filled with a question none of them could ignore anymore, not about her but about themselves, about what they knew, what they assumed, and what they had never thought to question until now. The room did not rush to fill the silence this time, it respected it, or perhaps it feared breaking something that had only just been revealed, and Ethan Caldwell sat there for a moment longer than usual without speaking, which for a man like him was not hesitation, it was recalibration, because what Naomi Brooks had done was not simply answer questions, she had changed the frame in which those questions existed, and that kind of shift did not disappear when the conversation moved on. It followed, it lingered, it demanded a response that was no longer automatic, and so when Ethan finally reached for his glass, it was slower, more deliberate, as if even that simple motion required intention now. He glanced at the wine, then back at Naomi, who had already returned to the edge of the room, moving with the same quiet efficiency, but now carrying something else with her, something no uniform could contain. And Ethan set the glass down without drinking, a small decision, but one that did not go unnoticed by the people closest to him. You said clarity matters more than proving something, he called out, not loudly, but clearly enough to draw her attention again, and Naomi turned once more, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. Yes, sir, she replied, and Ethan nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself before speaking again. Then clarify something for me, he said, his tone now stripped of all pretense, direct in a way it had not been all night. Why stay here? And the question landed heavier than the others, because it was no longer about knowledge, no longer about language or wine or even the room itself, it was about her, about choice, about the quiet contradiction that no one else had dared to address. And a few guests shifted in their seats, sensing that this question crossed a line that had previously gone unspoken. But Naomi did not flinch, she did not retreat. She simply stepped forward again, not closer to the table, but closer to the moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision, but now there was something deeper beneath it, something grounded, something earned. Because this is where people reveal themselves, she said, and the words settled into the space with a weight that did not need explanation. Not when they are trying to impress, she continued, her gaze moving briefly across the table, not accusing, not judging, just seeing, but when they believe they already have. And that line shifted something again, not dramatically, but enough that a few eyes dropped, a few expressions tightened, not out of guilt but out of recognition, and Ethan watched her carefully, not interrupting, not redirecting, because he understood now that every word she chose was intentional, that nothing she said was accidental. And what do you do with what you see? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, and Naomi met his gaze fully this time, not as a server, not as someone passing through, but as someone standing firmly in her own understanding. I learn, she said simply, and then after a brief pause, one that allowed the word to settle before it expanded. And sometimes I remind people of what they are showing. And the room went still again, not out of shock but out of clarity, because there was no performance left in that exchange, no illusion to hide behind, just truth, quiet and undeniable. And Ethan leaned back slowly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer calculated, but open in a way that was rare for him, because for the first time that night, he was not trying to control the narrative, he was listening to it unfold. And Naomi, already stepping back once more, did not wait for acknowledgement, did not seek validation. She returned to her place at the edge of the room, but the edge no longer meant invisible, it meant perspective, and from that perspective she had already changed everything. By the time the next course arrived, the room had settled into something quieter, not less powerful but more aware, like every word now carried a second meaning beneath it, and Ethan Caldwell no longer rushed to fill that space. He let it breathe, let it exist, something he had rarely done in rooms built for speed and certainty, and as Naomi moved between tables, her presence no longer blended into the background, it anchored the rhythm instead, subtle but undeniable, and one of the guests, woman who had remained mostly silent until now, leaned forward slightly, her curiosity no longer disguised. "You said you studied in Paris," she began, her tone careful, respectful in a way it had not been earlier. "But you also said you are here to observe, so what did you expect to find in a place like this?" And the question did not carry judgment, it carried genuine interest, and Naomi paused again, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that this moment was different from the others. This was not a challenge, not a test, but an opening, and she turned slightly toward the table, her expression calm, her voice steady. "I expected to find patterns," she said, and a few brows lifted, not in confusion but in intrigue. "Patterns of how people speak when they feel secure and how they speak when they do not," she continued, her gaze moving briefly across the table, not lingering on anyone, but noticing everything. "Patterns of what gets valued and what gets overlooked." And Ethan listened closely now, not interrupting, not redirecting, because he understood that what she was offering was not just insight. It was access to something that could not be measured on a balance sheet or predicted in a report. "And did you find what you were looking for?" he asked quietly, his tone no longer carrying authority, but something closer to respect, and Naomi met his gaze, not as someone beneath him, but as someone standing in her own clarity. "Yes," she said simply, and then after a pause that allowed the word to settle, "and more." And that answer did not close the conversation, it expanded it, because it implied that what she had seen went beyond expectation, beyond theory, into something real, something lived, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden. "Then tell me," he said, not as a command but as a request. "What did you learn?" And Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not. No, but because she understood that this answer would not just describe the room, it would define it. She stepped closer, her voice calm, measured, but carrying a quiet weight that drew everyone in without effort. "I learned that knowledge is often performed," she said, and a few eyes shifted, not in disagreement but in recognition. "But understanding is usually quiet," she continued, her gaze steady, her tone unchanged. "And the two are not the same." And the room fell still again, not because the statement was loud, but because it was precise, because it cut through something that no one had named out loud before, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture no longer signaling control but reflection, because he understood exactly what she meant. He had built his world on performance, on certainty, on the ability to appear ahead of everyone else, but this was different. This was something he could not replicate without first acknowledging it. And Naomi, sensing the moment had reached its natural edge, stepped back once more, returning to her role. But the role no longer defined her, because what she had revealed was not just intelligence, it was perspective, and perspective once shared does not disappear, it reshapes everything that follows. And in that room, high above the city, something invisible had shifted into view, something no one could ignore anymore, not even the man who once believed he controlled it all. The city outside had not changed, the skyline still stretched in perfect lines of light and ambition, the traffic still moved in distant ribbons far below. But inside that room, something had shifted in a way no one could measure, and Ethan Caldwell felt it more clearly now than ever, not as a disruption, but as a revelation, because for all the rooms he had owned, all the negotiations he had controlled, all the people he had read and predicted and outmaneuvered, this was different. This was not about winning, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to sit in that realization without trying to reshape it, without trying to turn it into leverage. He simply let it exist. And as Naomi Brooks moved quietly toward the far end of the room, clearing a glass that no one else had noticed, Ethan stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate calm that drew every eye back to him, and for a moment it seemed like the room would return to its original pattern, that he would reclaim the space with a familiar tone, a confident statement, something that would restore the balance everyone understood. But he did not do that. Instead, he looked directly at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, and when he spoke, his voice carried something it had not carried before, not authority, not performance, but acknowledgement. "Naomi," he said, and the use of her name, spoken clearly in a room that had once overlooked it, landed with quiet weight. "Thank you." And the words were simple, almost understated, but in that space, from that man, they meant more than any contract ever signed at that table. And a few guests shifted slightly, not because they were uncomfortable, but because they understood what had just happened. They had witnessed a moment that did not fit into the usual language of power, and Naomi paused, turning once more, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, but her eyes for just a fraction of a second softened, not with surprise but with recognition, because acknowledgement, real acknowledgement, is not loud, it is precise. "You are welcome, sir," she replied, her voice even, respectful but no longer small, and Ethan nodded once, not as a dismissal, but as a completion, as if something unspoken had finally reached its end, and he did not say anything else. He did not try to extend the moment, because he understood now that some moments do not need to be expanded, they need to be respected, and as he sat back down, the room did not rush to fill the silence, it held it, just for a second longer than usual, just long enough for everyone to feel what had changed, and then, slowly, naturally, conversation resumed, but it was different now, softer, more aware, less certain, because once clarity enters a space, certainty has to make room for it, and Naomi, already returning to the quiet rhythm of her work, did not look back again, she did not wait to be seen, she did not need to, because what she had revealed did not belong to that moment alone, it belonged to something larger, something that would follow every person in that room long after the night ended, and as the skyline continued to glow beyond the glass, unchanged and indifferent, one truth settled quietly into place, not announced, not declared, but understood, that power can command attention, but presence, real presence, can redefine it, and that night, in a room built on certainty, it was not the man with the money who changed the story, it was the woman who never needed to prove she understood it.